All right, so here is a think, pair, share problem. This is one that it's intended for the student to try and work out on their own, and then come back and maybe watch this video. But this one, we are generating a frequency distribution table with a relative frequency column and a cumulative relative frequency column. We're trying to complete this on our own, as well as creating a bar chart and an OGIF chart of this data. So kind of doing everything that you've learned so far in 1.3. I'll also demonstrate how you can calculate these values using your graphing calculators, both Texas Instruments and NumWorks. All right, so let's look at this one. So the time worked per day by college students. 20 students were asked how many hours they worked per day. Their responses in hours are as follows. So let the random variable h be equal to the number of hours worked per day. For simplicity, the data has been sorted in ascending order. So here's our random variable h, which represents the number of hours worked per day. And each number is the number of hours worked per day by an individual student. Okay, and so what we've got here is the kind of layout of a frequency distribution table. So let's start by working on this. Let's hope everything kind of works here the way I expect it to. So if we look at the frequency for working 2 hours a day, we can see we had 3 students that worked 2 hours per day. So I'm going to put a frequency of 3. Okay, now for 3 hours a day, that was, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have a frequency of 5. Now for 4 hours a day, we've got 3 again. For 5 hours a day, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And for 6 hours a day, we had 2 students. And for 7 hours a day, we had 1. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so we've got our frequency column. Now, to kind of stay up to date, let's catch up where we are here with where you should be using your graphing calculator. All right, so first let's go to the Texas Instruments, and we want to go into the list editor. So to get into the list editor, you hit the Stat button. Under the Edit menu, you want to go to Edit, the Edit option. Okay, so you can see here, I've got my list of frequencies. Let me go ahead and just put it in more like the table exactly. That'll be fine. Let me correct this issue really quick. So I'm going to set list 2 to list 1 to copy those over. And list 1 is going to be my random variable h, number of hours worked. So some working 2 hours, some working 3 hours, some working 4 hours, some working 5, some working 6, some working 7. Okay, these values aren't really going to factor into anything here, but just so that, when you look at these columns, list 1 and list 2, it looks like this is list 1 and this is list 2. Okay, so it matches the think, pair, share that we're doing a little more closely. All right, so this is what we've gotten so far with the Texas Instruments calculator. Let's look over here at the NumWorks and let's catch that up. So on the NumWorks calculator, you're going to want to go into the Statistics app. Click OK. And the way the Statistics app is organized is that the columns are arranged in pairs. So we have a value 1 column followed by a frequency n column. So we have a V1, N1, and then next to it, we have a V2, N2, and next to that, we have a V3, N3. All right, So, I think maybe implementing relative frequency and cumulative relative frequency isn't as straightforward on the numworks as it is on the Texas Instruments, because the Texas Instruments, it's just these general lists that you kind of use for everything. The numworks calculator, these columns, are a little more specific. So it makes it maybe a little difficult sometimes to use. But anyway, we'll carry forward with both. You'll see how both can be used to achieve the same goal here. All right. So here we've got both calculators with the first two columns of our frequency distribution table, number of hours, and then the frequency for each number of hours in our category there. Okay, now we need to calculate the relative frequency. So the relative frequency of a given row, that's why it's R sub I. So the relative frequency of a given row is equal to the frequency in that row divided by n, the total number of datums, the sample size. And I think off to the side, I put a sum of 20. So if we were to take all of these frequencies and add them together, we would end up with a frequency of 20. So let's see here. Yeah, that looks like that's going to be about right. But sometimes this could be, something that maybe you don't necessarily want to calculate by just adding all those together. So I'll show you the calculator function to kind of do that for you. All right, so let's just kind of by hand show how we would end up calculating this, okay? So the relative frequency of the first row is going to be equal to the frequency of the first row divided by the sample size. All right, so the frequency of the first row is 3. That's this value right here, divided by the sum of all the frequencies. So the sum of all the frequencies was 20, and that's our sample size. So that's going to be divided by 20. 3 divided by 20 is going to give us a relative frequency of 0.15 or 15.0%. Okay, so to calculate the relative frequency of the second row, so the relative frequency of the second row is equal to the frequency of the second row all over the sample size. So the frequency of the second row is going to be 5, and then divide that by 20, and we have 0.25, which is 25.0%. For the third row, okay, so we have the relative frequency of the third row. That's the frequency of the third row divided by n. So that's going to be 3 over 20, which is the same as what we calculated earlier. Okay. For the fourth row, the relative frequency of the fourth row is equal to the frequency of the fourth row divided by n. And so the frequency of the fourth row is now 6. And 6 divided by 20 is going to be 0.30. Oops. That's 30%, not 15%. There we go. The relative frequency of the fifth row is the frequency of the fifth row divided by n, which is going to be 2 over 20, which is 0.10, which is 10%. And then the relative frequency of the sixth row is the frequency of the sixth row divided by n, which will be 1 over 20, which is 0.05, which is 5%. All right, so let's look at maybe calculating these values here, these relative frequency values, on each calculator. All right, so let's come over here to the Texas Instruments. And we want to come over here to list 3. And so what we want from list 3 is we want to take the frequency and divide it by 20. Okay, but let's pretend. So one way we could do it is we could say list 2 divided by 20. So we could go second list 2, but divided by 20. Okay, and that's going to calculate all of these relative frequencies right on down the line. Okay, but what if you didn't calculate this 20, in the denominator? How else would you get that? So the other way you could get it is let's look at our list functions. Okay, so if we hit second and the stat button, that'll give us functions that we can do on lists. And so what we want to do is we want to come over here to math and we want to do a sum. Okay, so under the math menu, the sum option, click enter. And so we want to take our list of frequencies and divide it by the sum of all of those frequencies. So the sum of L2, right? We know that this should add up to 20. Okay, but again, if this was not as simple of an example, um, you'd have to kind of retype all those in, so this is using the calculator to kind of make your life a little bit easier. So if we go ahead and hit enter, now you can see we get 0.15, 0.25, right? 0.15, 0.25, 0.15, 0.3, 0.15, 0.3, and then 0.10, 0.05, 0.10, 0.05. All right, so it's instructive to do this by hand so that you get better at using formulas, okay, and substituting numbers in for variables, okay, and doing that kind of within a table. But once you understand what this process is, then you have an understanding of what the calculator is doing and whether what it's doing looks right. Okay. Now let's do this same process, but on the NumWorks calculator. All right. Now, in order to make this work correctly, and I think I showed this in a previous video, there's a wrong way to do it and a right way to do it. Okay. And the right way to do it is, so we've got V1 and N1. So this is our values, the number of hours worked per day. And this was the frequency for each of those categories. Now we want to come over here to these other columns, V2 and N2, and we need to bring over this value list. Okay, so we're going to set V2 equal to V1. So right now, V2 is selected. I'm going to click OK. And I want to fill this with a formula. I'm just going to say empty. And so I want V2, this column V2, to be equal to the same values as V1. So I'm just going to hit Shift, Alpha, and then the division button. So this will print a capital V, and then I can type a 1. So I want column V2 to be the same as column V1. So if I hit execute or OK, it takes these values and it just copies them over here. Okay. So now frequency of in this second pair of columns, we can actually turn this into a relative frequency now. Okay, so in order to turn this into a relative frequency, it's going to be the frequency divided by the sum of all the frequencies, just like what we did here with the Texas Instruments calculator. So with frequency selected, so N2, column N2 selected, I'm going to click OK. I'm going to fill this with a formula, click OK. I'll have it empty. All right, so it's going to be frequency. So I need to put in an N1. So the letter N is on the number 8 key, and this needs to be a capital N. So I'm going to hit Shift, Alpha, 8, and then a 1. Then I'll hit divide. And now I want to do divide by the sum of all the frequencies, the sum of N1. Okay, so how do I get the sum function? Like I did here in the Texas Instruments calculator. So we've got a button here on the numWorks, which has what looks like a little toolbox. It has the word paste in orange above it. Okay, this is the toolbox button here. So click on that. And then we will scroll down to lists. So we want to look at toolbox functions for lists. Okay, then we want to come down to operations because we want to perform an operation on a list of numbers. And if we scroll down here, we have sum of the elements. So if I click OK, now it's got the word sum here, and I want to type in an N1 and then follow that up with the right parentheses. So to get a capital N, I'm going to put Shift Alpha 8. It gives me a capital N and then a 1, right parentheses. So again, we got frequencies over the sum of all the frequencies. That again is what this formula is. Frequencies over the sum of all the frequencies, right? The sum of all the frequencies is what our sample size is. Okay, so now as soon as I hit execute, watch this column fill up. There we go. And you can see we've got 0.15, 0.15, 0.25, 0.25, 0.15, 0.15, 0.3, 0.3, 0.1, 0.1, 0.05, 0.05. Okay, same numbers. Okay, so let's come back to this cumulative relative frequency. Okay, and this is the formula for the cumulative relative frequency. So the cumulative relative frequency of the first row is equal to the relative frequency of the first row plus the cumulative relative frequency of the row before it, the previous row. We don't have a previous row to the first one, so that's just going to be 0. So the cumulative relative frequency in our first row here is just going to be the relative frequency of the first row, which was 0.15. Okay, the cumulative relative frequency of the second row is going to be the relative frequency of the second row plus cumulative relative frequency of the previous row. So what we're going to have is the relative frequency of the second row is 0.25. That's going to be plus the cumulative relative frequency in the previous row, 0.15. So this second cumulative relative frequency is going to be 0.25 plus 0.15, which is 0.40. Let me box that just to make it stand out. Okay. The cumulative relative frequency of the third row is equal to the relative frequency of the third row plus the cumulative relative frequency of the previous row. So the relative frequency in the third row, okay, was 0.15 plus the previous cumulative relative frequency, which is 0.4. So the cumulative relative frequency of the third row is 0.15 plus 0.4, that's 0.55. Okay, the cumulative relative frequency of the fourth row is equal to the relative frequency of the fourth row plus the cumulative relative frequency of the previous row. So the relative frequency here in this row is 0.3. And the cumulative relative frequency of the previous row is 0.55. So the cumulative relative frequency of the fourth row is 0.3 plus 0.55, which is 0.85. All right, the cumulative relative frequency of the fifth row is the relative frequency of the fifth row plus the cumulative relative frequency of the previous row. So the relative frequency of the fifth row is 0.10 plus the cumulative relative frequency of the previous row, 0.85. So the cumulative relative frequency of the fifth row is 0.10 plus 0.85, which is 0.95. Now the cumulative relative frequency of the sixth row is equal to the relative frequency of the sixth row plus the cumulative relative frequency of the previous row. So the relative frequency of the sixth row is 0.05 plus the cumulative relative frequency of the previous row, 0.95. So the cumulative relative frequency of the sixth row is 1.00. And if we've done everything right, our last cumulative relative frequency should be 1. So that's kind of a confirmation that we've done this correct. So let's go ahead and do this calculation on our calculators. So let me come over here to the Texas Instruments, and we want list 4 to be our column of cumulative relative frequencies. So these numbers of 0.15, 0.4, 0.55, 0.85, 0.95, and 1. So to get this, what we need to do is we need to go to our list of list functions, okay, which is in blue above the stat button. For me, it's blue. Other calculators, it might be orange. Okay, but I'm going to hit the second button with the stat button. I'm going to go to ops. And the operation I want to perform is this one called cumulative sum. So what we want to do is we want to do a cumulative sum of the frequency column. So I'm going to hit enter. So list 4 is going to be the cumulative sum of list 3, our list of relative frequencies. So I'm going to hit second and 3 to put in list 3, right parentheses. If I hit enter, there we get 0.15, 0.15, 0.40, 0.40, 0.55, 0.55, 0.85, 0.85, 0.95, 0.95, 1, and 1. All right. Okay. Now let's see here. Let's go over to the NumWorks calculator. Okay, so now that we've got, our values here in V2 and we have our relative frequencies here in N2, we can calculate the cumulative relative frequency by just toggling a switch. So take frequency N2, have that selected, right? Make sure that this column heading is selected. Click OK. Scroll down to where it says cumulative frequencies and notice that it's off. This will display a new column that we haven't seen yet. So click OK. Now to get out of this, hit this backspace button, which looks like an arrow turned on itself. And now we've got this extra column, CF. This means cumulative frequency. And you can see we've got 0.15, 0.15, 0.4, 0.4, 0.55, 0.55, 0.85, 0.85, 0.95, 0.95, 1, and 1. Okay, so I've just shown how you can use both calculators, in this example, to calculate both the relative frequency and the cumulative relative frequency. Okay, so all of these values we've been able to calculate here on the calculator. All right, let's try and maybe answer each of these questions using this table that we just created. So question one, what percent of students work exactly 4 hours? Okay, so what we need to do is look down this first column and we see here are the students that worked 4 hours. It says what percent of students work exactly 4 hours? So exactly four, which means we are going to limit ourselves to just this row. And when it says what percent, what we're looking for is what relative frequency in percent, okay, where our random variable is equal to 4, okay? So that percent is 0.15 or 15%. That's our answer, okay? What percent of students work less than 3 hours? All right, so working less than 3 hours, that's going to be less than 3. Not less than or equal to, but just less than. So what would be considered less than 3 on this table that we've got here? Um, okay, so my computer is thinking, so I have to wait. Here we go. Okay. Well, so here we've got 3. The only number of hours in our table that's less than 3 is going to be 2. Okay, so what's the relative frequency of students that worked 2 hours? That's 15%. Okay, let's go down to the third one. So what is the percent of students that work from 4 to 6 hours? Okay, so this is going to be uh, like the relative frequency of working 4 hours. So we'll put maybe h equals 4 plus the relative frequency of h equaling 5 plus the relative frequency of h equaling 6. Okay, so the relative frequency of 4 hours is 15% plus the relative frequency of 5 hours, which was 30%, plus the relative frequency of working 6 hours. That's 10%. Okay, 15 plus 30 is 45, and 45 plus 10 is 55. Okay, so a little over half of students work between 4 and 6 hours. All right, let's look at some more questions here. So what fraction of the students work from 6 to 7 hours? So notice that instead of asking for a percentage, okay, instead of asking for a percentage, now we're being asked for a fraction. So of course, a percent, we know that that's going to be some value between 0 and 100. But now that it's asking for a fraction, it wants a value between 0 and 1. Okay. So what we're going to have is we're going to have the relative frequency, okay, expressed as a value between 0 and 1 for 6 hours plus relative frequency for the number of hours worked by a student being equal to 7. So what was the relative frequency for h equals 6? That was 0.10. So 0.10 plus the relative frequency for 7, that's 0.05. And 0.10 plus 0.05 is going to be 0.15. Okay. Um, another way you could do this too, when it talks about fractions, I got kind of lucky with this example, in which case these relative frequencies came out to just two decimal place answers. But if these relative frequencies hadn't been just two decimal places really nicely and cleanly, I could have used fractions instead. Okay. So in place of 0.10, I could have used 2 over 20. And in place of 0.05, I could have used 1 over 20. So something like this. And that would give me 3 over 20. So I could have written the answer like that as well. In which case, when it says what fraction, I mean, here we're actually giving a fraction. Okay. But a decimal value between 0 and 1 is also called a fractional value. Okay. What is the frequency of students that work from 3 to 6 hours? So now we're being asked specifically for frequencies now. So we're going to have the frequency for students that worked 3 hours plus the frequency for students that worked 4 hours plus the frequency for students that worked 5 hours plus the frequency for students that worked 6 hours. So hopefully you can kind of see how using these subscripts to this to variables is kind of helpful. Okay. So let's see here. The frequency for working 3 hours, you can look up on your page. I'm kind of looking at my page as well. That was 5 plus working 4 hours, there was a frequency of 3 plus working 5 hours, there were 6 of those plus 6 hours, there were 2 of those. All right, so 5 plus 3 is 8, 6 plus 2 is 8. So that's going to be 16. So there were 16 students that worked 3 to 6 hours per day. All right, what is the relative frequency of students that work less, let's see, that work 3 or less hours? Okay, so that work 3 or less hours. So that's going to be less than or equal to 3. So we're going to have a relative frequency of 2 plus a relative frequency of 3. All right. So a relative frequency of 2 is going to be 0.15 plus a relative frequency of 3 hours per day. I think that was 0.25. So that's going to be 0.40. All right, what is the cumulative relative frequency for 4? Explain what this number tells you about the data. All right, so let's look and see what the cumulative relative frequency was at 4 hours of work per day. So here at 4 hours of work per day, we have a cumulative relative frequency of 0.55 or 55%. Okay, so this one is going to be, so the cumulative relative frequency for the number of hours worked being equal to 4, that was equal to 55%. Okay, what does that number tell you about the data? It tells us that a little more than half of students are working 4 hours or less per day. All right. The last question here, question 8, is to create a bar chart of relative frequency and an ogive graph of cumulative relative frequency. All right. So just do the best you can to sketch this. So on the left-hand side, we'll sketch our bar chart. And on the right-hand side, we'll sketch an ogive graph. Okay. The bar chart, let's see, how much space do I got? Okay. The bar chart is going to have an X and Y axis, something like that. So will the ogive. There we go. On the bar chart, we got categories across the bottom. So this is hours. Let's see. Let me actually do this. Let's do, let's put work time, and that's going to be in hours per day. And it's the same here on the ogive graph. So we've got work time, which is in hours per day. You always want to label your axes. All right. And we've got, let's see, six categories. So we've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 hours. We'll do the same thing here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, that looks good. Now on the bar chart, this is where we're going to have relative frequency. Okay, and that's going to be, we'll do that in percent. And on the ogive, this is going to be cumulative relative frequency. We'll also do this as a percent. Okay, so the relative frequency, we're going to have like a minimum. So think here, a minimum of 0%. And what's going to be our maximum? What was the highest relative frequency that we had? We had 30%. So we're going to want to have maybe up to 35% on our vertical axis. Okay. So let's see here. If we do 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. All right. With the cumulative relative frequency, that has to go from 0 to 100%. So we'll put 0 here. And let's see here, we're going to have 50% here, 100% there. Now we need to subdivide these into 5 subdivisions each. So we're going to put 4 marks. So I'll do 1, 2, 3, 4. Just do your best to make that as equal as possible. And let's do that again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So let's see here. On our bar chart, 2 hours had a relative frequency of 15%. So here for 2, I'm going to go up to 15 and come over, and I'll put 15 as a data label on top of that. 3 hours, that was 25%. So I'm going to come all the way up to 25, like that. All right, 4 hours, that was 15%, so it's going to be the same height as 2 work hours. I guess I should put percentages here. There we go. 5, that was 30%. So we're going to come way up here. I'm just putting a little guideline so I kind of know where to stop. There we go. There we go. You can't tell, but I'm holding my breath because I'm trying to make as straight a vertical line as possible. Okay, 6, that's 10%. So I'm going to come over. Like that. And then 5% for 7 hours of work per day. All right. And if you want to, you can be a little creative. You can kind of fill these in so they'll stand out a little bit more. Something like that. There we go. Okay, not too shabby. Now let's do the ogive graph. Okay, so the cumulative relative frequency for 2, that was 15%. So that's going to be right here. And then at 3, that's 40%. So we're going to come up from 3, come over from 40, right there. At 4, it's going to be 55%. So again, I'm reading this from the table. You've probably got that in front of you. Right about there. 5, we've got 85%. 85% is between 80 and 90. 6, that's 10%. There. And 7 is 5%, which is half of that. No, 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 no. Wait a minute. Hold it. Hold it. Dr. Morales is doing it wrong. Hopefully you're screaming at your monitor going, wait, Dr. Morales, you're doing it wrong. Because I was just now graphing relative frequency, right? We need cumulative relative frequency. Okay, so for 6, that should be 95%. I'm just testing to see whether you're still awake. Here we go. 7, that was 100% right there. Now we can go ahead and connect these data points with straight lines in order to make this ogive graph. So you can see there's the greatest jump. That's, going from 4 to 5, hours here. Okay, so that is the last question for this think, pair, share. This was a good think, pair, share because it kind of sums up everything that we've done in this section, from creating, an entire frequency distribution table with relative frequency and cumulative relative frequency, calculating this with your calculator, as well as answering specific questions using information from the table, and then, making a bar chart and an ogive graph as well. Okay, that's it for 1.3. Let me know if you have any questions.